have 50 Baptists that I think everybody should know, and we're on number 47. And getting towards the end, I'll explain some things about that at the end. But this morning, just talk a little bit about Russia and the former Soviet Union. But the Russian Orthodox Church has always persecuted Baptists throughout the land of Russia. The Baptists were legalized. Well, as far as we know, the first Baptist church that we know of, a man was baptized in about 1860, somewhere in there, by a German Baptist pastor. Interestingly enough, when Johann Anken, who you might remember we studied, he's considered the father of the German Baptists in the 1800s, and he sent missionaries into Russia, and they began churches, and the first one we're aware of is this baptism in 1865, somewhere around there. But and those churches started to grow like wildfire, and the Russian Orthodox Church was the state church, and they began to persecute the Baptists. They were legalized in 1879. The Baptists were legalized in 1879, but little changed because the state church feared the aggressive soul winning and evangelistic outreaches of the Baptists. Now, prior to 1917, when the Tsarist regime fell to the communists, the state church actually used the police power of the state to persecute the Baptists. One Baptist leader wrote this. He said, "This was a time of horrible persecutions, exiles, arrests, fines, and beatings of believers rained down abundantly upon the audacious followers of the gospel. Under continual fear of being caught by the police, the brothers nevertheless did not cease their meetings, holding them in basements, in woods, in cemeteries, in ravines, and in the apartments of the more well-to-do brothers. A full account of the suffering," and I'm saying this, a full account of the suffering of our Baptist brethren there in Russia has yet to be written. Georgi Vins was born in January 1928 in Siberia, Russia. His father and mother, Peter and Lydia Vins, had just moved there 2 years earlier. Peter was called to become a missionary to the people in Siberia. When Georgi was 2 years old, his father was arrested for preaching the gospel and sent to prison for 3 years. He was released after 3 years, but soon he was rearrested and sent to prison again for another 3 years. They never heard from their father again for 60 years. They never knew what happened to Peter. And the little boy, Georgi, was brought up by his mother. Georgi's mother, Lydia, faithfully served the Lord. She raised the little boy not knowing if she'd ever see her husband again. She poured herself into the ministry of their little church there in Siberia, and she made it her own ministry in a sense to assist the families of other religious prisoners, and this became a big deal. These prison camps were separate. Several times. Russia's a very large country, and the prison camps were situated in the design of the Russian government as far away from the population as they could get. So they would send them either further north into really terrible regions. And one of the ideas was to get them as far away from their families as possible, so the families couldn't come and visit. And so she did a lot to try to get the families to the prisoners, helping them raise food supplies and money to do that. She herself was arrested later in life at 65. She was arrested and served 3 years for this far-reaching ministry that she worked in. After World War II, the two of them, Georgi and his mother, moved to Kiev, and he was able to earn an engineering degree at that time. He joined and began to serve in the Kiev Baptist Church there in Kiev, and the Baptists were enjoying kind of a small window of freedom and independence for a time, but in 1959, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier, he began his anti-religious persecution, and it started very simply. You have to see the design. The state has all the time it needs. It doesn't need to do everything today. It can do it over several generations. So one of the first things they did, interestingly enough, is all children were forbidden to attend church. You say, why would that matter? Because the idea of the state was to, over a couple generations, they have all the time they need to get the children as far away from God as possible. I thought this morning, if you know anything about the former Soviet Union, those generations are godless. Talk to Dave Schrock sometime about the people, and they don't even know God, and that's the fault of the parents, of course, or several generations back. But the state knew what it was doing and wanted to do that. So anyway, and then the state wanted to register the churches. You could attend church if your church was registered and took the state's license. Well, Vins became one of the leading figures in the campaigns to resist state pressure to accept the registration and to join what was called the Baptist Union. So he publicly opposed his own pastor in Kiev when the pastor accepted the state's new registration. And several families left that church. The church split off, and Vins formed a church and became the pastor of this small flock, in spite of the fact that he didn't have any theological training. And they had to meet in hiding, of course. His daughter, Natasha, writes a book years later and talks about how they would take the train and then jump on a bus and then jump on another bus, and they would go 2 hours outside of Kiev and meet in the woods in the forest outside of Kiev. And you see a picture there, an actual picture of one of the meetings of one of the small churches there. Pastor Vins became known across the land for his fearless stand and work as a leader of Baptist churches that resisted the Soviet government controls. In 1965, there was a massive protest, really kind of astonishing, and Baptists converged from all over Russia to Moscow, and they demonstrated outside the Central Committee building in Moscow. A few days later, Vins and a couple of pastors, people were arrested, of course, and so a few days later, Vins and some pastors went to the Central Committee one of the reasons was to find out what had happened to these people that were arrested. They were arrested on the spot, and Pastor Vins was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. His wife was left to raise their 4 children, and he served those 3 years. After that, he was released, but he again began working with those churches that needed help during this time of trying not to be registered and follow the Soviet will there. And for this, he was arrested again in 1975, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Headlines all over the world picked this up because by this time, Vins was a kind of a well-known figure, and he had become actually the most famous religious prisoner in the Soviet Union. And the years of hard labor, the persecution that he suffered, and the description of what went on in those camps is described in his writings. We're not going to go into all that, but in my talk this morning. But those writings those books are fascinating to read about the stories, and we've told some of those stories here. But his soul winning and his personal work among those men and women in those prison camps is really make for amazing stories. On April 26, 1979, he was abruptly wakened out of sleep, and in the middle of the night, and he was told to change into his own clothes. He's completely unaware of what was going on. He was rushed to an airport, and he was flown to Moscow for what would be his last night on Soviet soil. The following day, he was told that because of his anti-Soviet views and his activity, the Presidium of the Soviet Union had stripped him of his Soviet citizenship, and he was being expelled from the country. He protested that in vain. He said his activity was not anti-Soviet, but he was told this, to write down the names of anyone who you want to go with you. We're expelling you. We don't care what you say. We're expelling you, and we're going to give you a chance to write down a few names. Not knowing if that was a trick or not, he, by faith, wrote those names down. He wrote down his family, of course, his wife, his children, his mother, and his niece. He was driven to the Moscow airport. They met 2 American embassy officials on the plane, but they weren't told anything except they were being flown to America. It was not until they landed in New York that they learned that 2 Russian spies had been captured, found doing work in Washington, D.C. They were captured, they were convicted of espionage, and he and 5 other pastors, the White House had worked out an exchange for those 5 pastors, or I should have told the 5 pastors, and these 2 spies. So they landed at Kennedy Airport, very interesting, very clandestine espionage here. And the 5 walked off the plane at one end, and the spies walked onto the plane at the other end, and then left back to Moscow. Once in the United States, Vins began settled down, I should say, and began really a very different life in exile. And actually, he lived in Elkhart, Indiana for the rest of his life. He made his home there. He began learning English. He received invitations to the White House and, of course, innumerable events around the world. When the Soviet Union began to fall apart in the late 80s and the early 90s, he eventually was able to go back to the Soviet Union and preach and reacquaint himself with those churches that he supported while he was here in America for those roughly 10 or 15 years while he was in exile. In 1995, Mikhail Gorbachev took away the law that had stripped him of his citizenship, and he was allowed back into the country, as I said. And Gorbachev opened up the KGB files so he could read about what happened to his father. Very, very touching moment in his books that he talks about. His father was executed. They never knew, 65 years later. His father was executed in prison for his work with the prisoners there. And he realized as he read that throughout his own battles with the Soviet authorities, he had actually been following in his own father's footsteps and didn't even know it. He was diagnosed with brain cancer in 1997. The Lord took him home in 1998. Georgi Vins is a true Baptist hero of the faith. He was a very thoughtful leader with a very serious presence. Maybe some of the pictures can give you that idea. He was faithful to the Lord to the end of his life. And really, I think of him as representing thousands and thousands of Baptist pastors, pastors' wives, Baptist laymen who were tortured, exiled, even murdered for their faith in the Soviet Union in the 1900s. In our lifetime. And the story is thrilling. He has written several books. I'll put a couple up on the screen. One that I talk about, and this is the name of a man that he met in prison, Conchabai. We'll tell that story in a few weeks. But these are fascinating stories, and if you would, I would just recommend that these are great books to have. The Gospel in Bonds. His daughter wrote a book, I believe, called Children of the Storm. Natasha wrote that, and then and these stories are really amazing stories you can read to your kids, and lots of pictures of the churches meeting in the woods and all that went on in that time. And so I want to thank the Lord for Georgi Vins and his great work and his faithfulness to the Lord.